Before I would talk about the topic I brought you today, let me carry on with my quick intro. So, I have over 18 years of experience in software engineering. I started back in 1998, so I'm a kind of old dude. I'm one of those few who accidentally become a software tester. And it's really true because it started back in 1999, and I was young and all I wanted was to work abroad. I was looking for opportunities, and one day my boss gave me an opportunity to become a test automation engineer in Helsinki, Finland. And I accepted the challenge even though I knew almost nothing about testing and knew nothing about test automation. But fortunately, testing became my passion, and it's still my passion. At halfway through my career, I almost stopped doing testing. I wanted to move Greece, get out of this money-making cycle, you know. I wanted to harvest olives and orange. Sadly, I was told I'm not qualified for that job. So I stayed with software testing. I think it's a good decision. So honestly speaking, I'm still passionate about software testing, and that's the reason why I'm standing here in front of you today. That's all about me. The title of my presentation is Mastering the Test Process Improvement. Let's see what's on the agenda. First, I will talk a bit about pitfalls during initiation, so before you do any sort of improvement. Then we will talk about frameworks and models available currently. Then I will pick a certain one. You know, we have a limited time today, so we can't cover all of them. I pick one, and I'm going to demonstrate how to do test process improvement using that specific framework. And at the end, we will talk about change management consideration. So that's it for today. I've created this slide to demonstrate to you what are the major process improvement frameworks and models available today, and to demonstrate to you how they are connected and interrelated to each other. Of course, this diagram is incomplete, so there's a lot more, but those are the most important ones. Out of those, we have two so-called software process improvement frameworks. They're quite generic, and they cover requirement engineering, project management, etc. Sadly, they are quite inappropriate for test process improvement because they are not detailed enough, honestly. These are CMMI and SPICE, so we will skip them. So let's see what else we have. We have two on the top. Probably you recognize this PDCA. This is also called the Deming cycle. This is generic continuous improvement framework. Today we won't cover them in detail, but of course it's better to study them because they cover certain aspects of test process improvement which are not covered by those test process frameworks, namely preparation and the deployment phase. And we have IDEAL. I think this is slightly more detailed and probably better than PDCA. So I would recommend you to study this too, because they will help you to become a real professional improver, a change manager. Yeah. So let's see, our focus is going to be this part, diagnosing and establishing. And as I said, we are today have a slightly limited time, so we won't talk about analytical approach, and we will only talk about one of those test process improvement frameworks. And this is TPI next. Yeah. So always start with, wow, we are engineers and we are pretty good at problem solving, probably you know that. And often we are too enthusiastic about solving a problem, and we tend not to pay enough attention to preparations. Actually, I did dozens of such mistakes when I paid no or not enough attention to preparation. What do I mean? You should always start with having the buy-in of the management. Why? Because probably you will need their support. Probably you will need a budget, because you may need to buy some new licenses, hardware, tools, order some trainings. So someone has to cover those costs. And also, someone has to authorize you to implement any sort of change. So it's pretty important. Also, you shouldn't forget about having the people's buy-in, their support, because they should understand why you want to change something, because process improvement is purely changing something. And people have to understand the reason, and they have to, it's better to have them with you on the same boat, because if they don't want this change, probably they will resist. and probably they will mess up everything. So I would recommend you to pay enough attention to this preparation and initiation part. Today, we have no time to go more in detail. Let's see what else we have. Yeah. Usually when we start improving something, we should know where we are. This is to assess your current status. And as we said, today we will use models to do this assessment, and we have no time to cover those content models today, and we will not cover SPIs, the software process improvement frameworks, because they are quite inappropriate. So we will mainly, So my first proposal, don't do it in isolation. Why? It's purely because you should know that you shouldn't and you can't do test process improvement in isolation. Rather, you should do it as part of a process improvement and generic improvement initiative. I would recommend you to do this. Why? Because maybe your issue is not within software testing, so you shouldn't try to fix it in software testing and try to cover those symptoms. You have to figure out what the real root cause is. Of course, you may not be an expert of requirement management, project management, but you shouldn't do, because it's a team effort. You should team up with people who has a different background and who knows those specific areas. Secondly, you should know that they are quite dependent. So sometimes you have cases when you need to change something in software testing and something in requirement management. So sometimes there are dependencies. And also sometimes test process improvement has certain preconditions, so you have to do something prior to do any test process improvement. So keep it in mind, there might be dependencies, and you should see the big picture. Yep, and that is what I started to talk about, assessing the actual status. And today we decided to talk about model-based process improvement, and we won't cover content-based, and also we won't cover SPIs. So I selected TPI Next, the reason I like it. That's it. So let's see how TPI Next looks like. It's a model, so it has a massive amount of good testing practices in its heart. This information is grouped this way. You shouldn't read this slide through. Basically, 3 big groups and 16 smaller groups. We call it key areas within those. And if you check them, we have a group called test strategy, metrics, defect management, test case design, test tools, test environment. So all these models somehow group this information. But usually the good practices are the same, regardless if it's TPI Next, TMMI. We have those fundamental good testing practices in their heart. We also have this. They define maturity levels. Basically, they help you to decide how good your practices, your way of workings are. In case of TPI Next, we have 4 maturity levels. The first one called initial. This is basically when you do ad hoc testing, so it's pretty much ad hoc, random. So your project success is pretty much based on your hard work, your effort, and sometimes on your luck. Then we have this, we call it controlled. Controlled means basically you do have the fundamental good testing practices, but you might not do it efficiently. And as you improve, you get to this level, we call it efficient. Efficient means you do the right thing efficiently. Just to give you an example, for example, you're not simply doing estimation based on your gut feelings, but you use certain estimation techniques. Or you're not just randomly writing test cases, but you do use some test case design techniques. So that's the difference, more efficiently doing what you did on control level. And at optimizing level, what you do is just fine-tune your system. It's pretty much advanced, I think. And you should know that all these levels comes with a price tag. So it's not for free, so not each company, each project has to reach that optimizing level. Actually, for most projects, it's way too much and way too expensive. Yeah, and how we do the assessment. So we have also a list of checkpoints to support your assessment. It's part of the model, actually. So what you do, you follow those checkpoints. We will check a couple of those. And you ask questions. during an interview. It's a face-to-face session with someone or a couple of persons. And you take notes, and finally, you evaluate how good that certain practice is. Let's take a good look at an example. For example, in case of test strategy, we have this. Test strategy is based on a product risk analysis. So basically, you ask this question, and you get some answer. Yes, no. If no, what's missing? If yes, what's the evidence? So you try to follow a quite structured approach. Model-based approach is like this. Quite massive, comprehensive, and very structured. We have a second example. There's a differentiation in test levels, test types, and test coverage, etc. So the answer could be yes, no, what's missing, what's there, what are the evidences. So it goes like this, and you have like 157 checkpoints questions to answer. So it could take quite some time to go through all the questions, but by the end, you will know how good the testing practices are at your project or at your organization. What's next? Of course, now we know where we are, so it's pretty cool. We are happy. We know what issues we have, and we collected them in a structured way. So the key point here is to collect them in a structured way, so don't miss everything, don't look over anything. So that's the key point why we use those models. Now we need to define the wanted state, so where we want to get to in principle. And as we discussed it, all these higher maturity levels comes with a price tag, so it costs something. And if you develop a safety critical system, it makes sense. But if you develop a small, little, tiny game for a mobile device, probably it's way too expensive. So you really have to just judge it. And you have to justify it, because maybe that extra cost is not justifiable in your case. Or if it is, maybe it's way too much, because maybe you are at still initial level. You know, you have to set a realistic goal and a goal which is justifiable in your context. Yep. So where we are now, we know where we are, we know where we want to get to. Now it's time to figure out how we are going to get to the wanted state. So, you know, when we are happy, we do a good job, good quality, and stuff like that. Fortunately, TPI Next and those models help us, first of all, to figure out the solution. It's important because you have an issue. Now you know you have an issue. Cool. But what the solution is, and luckily, these frameworks helps you and gives you some advices. Then it also helps you to set up a plan, because it's important, because now we know where we are. We have a wanted state. It might be a distant future, easily. Now we need to figure out in what order, what steps to take. First, we have improvement suggestions to help you to figure out a solution. It's part of the model. We have dozens of such suggestions, so it's not only one proposal. For example, involve various stakeholders in the product risk analysis and test strategy. That's an advice. And we have tons of advices for defect management, test case design, test management, estimation and planning, etc. This is part of the model. So now we know what the solution might be, and now we need to set up a plan. And these models helps you to define this staged incremental approach, because it's pretty important. Because as you can see, one maturity level is quite massive. Over 40 questions and requirements, so it's quite massive. It's not advisable to implement them in one step, because it makes no sense to follow a Big Bang approach. And that's why TPI Next defines those clusters. So they group those small requirements in smaller steps. We can call them increments. And if you follow this incremental approach, you will smoothly get to the wanted state. Those clusters are identified by capital letters. So one cluster is basically one letter. So A's, B's, C's, etc. Now we have a sort of plan, so we know where we want to get to, where we are. We have a rough schedule. Now, of course, you would like to know if you are on the right track, right? Because we are just doing something for weeks or months. So it's better to have some sort of metrics, indicators, to track the progress and to see if we are on the right track. That's why we define metrics. We won't talk about defining metrics too much today, but of course there might be quantitative, like lead time, cost, defect detection rate, And also, there are qualitative metrics like customer satisfactions. One thing I would suggest to start with a small number, and preferably pick ones which is easy to collect or maybe automatically collectible. So keep it in mind, track your progress, because you might not be heading to the right direction, easily. What's left? What's left? Keep improving. So that's the next phase. As previously said, we have this assessment tool. The good news, it's freely downloadable, so you can use it. It's basically an Excel with macros. And it has a nice feature to visualize your actual status, and this is a screenshot. So as you are progressing, you can see how good you are and how you are progressing, so you can easily show it to your customers, to your management team, to your people, all the stakeholders. So it's a pretty nice feature, and this tool is freely available from the website of a company, which name I won't announce today. Yep. I have created this terminology based on the well-known minimum viable product, because I felt MVP and my term, MVI, has quite some similarities. Because when we do process improvement, what we want, we would like to deliver value to the customer. It can be your colleague, actually. Why we do incremental software development? First of all, we would like to have quick feedback loop. And the same goes for process improvement, because your ID might not be perfect for the first time. You should know about it. It's better to have a feedback. Maybe it's 90% okay or 50%. So it's better to follow an incremental approach. And secondly, why you do this incremental delivery is because you want to continuously deliver something. And it's important in case of test process improvement, because if you do not change anything for years, probably people will lose interest and say, oh, nothing's going to change. So it's pretty important to keep people engaged and to pilot your IDs. Yep. And of course, you should check the end results. Why? You plan something like this, and maybe you end up with something else. So, it's flying, but it's different. It can be easily the case in case of test process improvement. And sometimes you also might have some side effects you haven't foreseen. So it's good to check it. It's not a big deal. Usually process improvement takes multiple cycles. So it's most of the times you don't realize a process improvement in one step. So no big deal, not a desire. Yep. Wow, last but not least. So as we said, we engineers are pretty good at problem solving. Yeah, cool. I'm also, I made lots of mistakes because I'm too enthusiastic about solving a problem. So I tend to pay not enough attention to preparation. And we also tend not to pay enough attention to deployment, properly deploying a change. But you should know that it's a big risk, because you might have the greatest ever ID. But if you can't implement it, and even in the worst case, you mess up everything, all your hard effort is just meaningless. You should know that people are different, and they respond to changes differently. For example, I'm a kind of person who don't mind changes, so I have no problem with changes. Of course, not in every second or every hour. But probably you know people around yourself who hate changes because they feel unsafe. And you should be aware of those human aspects before you do any sort of change, because process improvement is a change process, indeed. So if you want to be successful, you have to master change management as well. Because, a great ID worth nothing if you can't implement it. I drew this picture to demonstrate to you how people's emotions and feelings changes during the course of a change. As you can see, there are ups and downs, and it's natural, even with me. And every change starts with a shock. I don't mind changes, but when a change comes, I may feel, oh wow, I don't want it because it's Monday, or simply I don't like the idea. But there are people who hate changes, so for them this shock may last for weeks or months. This period is called the holding on. You know, I don't want this, so I will resist. If you do a good job, people will move on and get to the phase we call letting go. But this term might be misleading because you may assume, okay, we are done, okay, I'm okay. But you should know that the new status quo, the new way of working, is not stabilized yet. So if you feel I'm done, maybe you will stop and the new status quo, new way of working won't be stabilized. So if you do a good job, then finally you will get to this phase called moving on. I don't know how many of you have ever been to a hospital and had an operation. I've been this January. I wouldn't recommend you to go to a hospital and have an operation just to become a better test process improver. So this is not my suggestions, don't misunderstand me. But let's see how we can use the approach doctors do approach to an operation. So what they do first, usually they describe the procedure. Why? Because if you know what's going to happen to you, you probably might be less afraid of that operation or change. But the same goes for test process improvement, actually. No difference. If you know what's going to happen, there's a higher chance that you won't resist. Then they usually describe that, yeah, well, it's okay to have some pain for 2-3 weeks. And it's good, because if you know that pain is kind of okay after the operations, then you won't panic. And the same goes for process improvement or changing the way of working people work. If they know it's okay, so a temporary chaos, then they will treat it differently. And it's pretty important. And last but not least, if you are going to a private hospital, they even give you their phone number. You have someone to call in case you have questions or you have some issues. And the same goes for process improvement and change management. You should be available to people. And if you do all this, people will feel safe, and you have a higher chance that people will support this change and won't try to, resist and I'm going to do anything to stop this change. So if you do a good job, then finally you will get to this new phase, you will implement the change, and probably your colleagues are going to be much more happier, you're going to be a much more better quality product. Well, that was all for today. So let's sum it up quickly. First, we talk about those improvement frameworks, those generic continuous improvement frameworks. And we also talked about we have several options. I would recommend you to study them at least on a very high level, because it's good to know this is your tool set. I'm not going to say it's a silver bullet. It's not. It's an option, I would say. Then also we talked about paying enough attention for preparation. It's important to have the people's buy-in, have the people's support. It's also important to see the big picture and the fact that you should know about those dependencies. Then we talked about EPI Next, but there are other options on the market. Then we discussed the process improvement process, which started with assessing the actual status and setting a goal. Then we discussed the importance of implementing changes in smaller steps, then measure the result and repeat the cycle. And at the end, I think we talked about probably the most important part, implementing the change and properly managing those human issues. Trust me, that's usually more tricky than fix a problem. That was all for today. One final thought from me. You should know that processes often work because of things that are not described in the process, but done by the people who perform the process. You should know that you can't write a process, can't create a process which replaces human thinking. And actually, I wouldn't recommend you to create something which at least try to replace human thinking, human decisions. This is a framework to support people, but you should also have enthusiastic, talented, and skilled people, and this too will make your company, your project successful. And that was all about me, and I'm ready to answer a couple of questions. If we have no time for questions, you can grab me on the corridor during the social event and tomorrow, and during the meetup tomorrow afternoon. And you can find my contact details, so if you want to reach out to me, then that was all. Thank you.
Attila, I'm going to ask you the first question, and it goes as, do you have any best practices to share on how to determine the maturity level increase where added business value still worth its price.
How to determine the maturity level increase where added business value still worth. I think I'm too tired to even remember the whole sentence. First of all, I don't, so it's not, we don't have a rule of thumb that this is worth. So, you know, you always have to value, because when you do improvement, of course, you do an analysis. Analysis is partly figuring out what the problem and what the solution is. And usually, and of course, you have to justify those costs. Because, you know, when you figure out a solution, of course, you make an estimate how much it's going to cost. And you have to sell the idea. So this is a multiple cycle, you know, negotiation with the stakeholders. But I think it's, there's no rule of thumb for this. If you have experience, you do it in small iterations. But anyway, it's all about propose a solution, make an estimate how much it's going to cost, and usually you make estimate how much it's going to save. For example, if you introduce a tool, you just, for example, know that you will automate something. That's an idea. Then you pick a typical week and see how many times those activities are done which will be automated. And then you have a rough calculation how much you will save. And then you have the cost side, and that's it, I think. And if, of course, the benefits are greater, then the costs are justified. Just contact me. I don't want to advertise the company. Anyway, it's Sogeti. It's a Dutch company. You can download it from their website. These are Excel-based tools. Just grab me on the corridor. We can write it down to you. I don't know who asked this question. I think we can't talk about generally. I think it's more a human thing. Some people is more flexible. Some people are less flexible. I don't think we can generalize it that engineers are less flexible. I think you should recognize those patterns. You should know who's going to be an easy job to get on board, who's going to be difficult. So the bad news, it takes time and experience to recognize those personality types. So basically, you should know the persons who you are dealing with. I wouldn't recommend you to implement changes at one step at the whole company. So it's advisable to pick small project. And also, you have to evaluate the risk. So I wouldn't recommend you to pick a project to pilot an idea which is close to a delivery. So usually you pick a project which is representative. I'm saying representative because your company may have typical project, like 70% is pretty similar. There might be a smaller project which might not be representative. So I would recommend you to pick a representative one to. It depends on the size of the organization, but I wouldn't recommend you to do a deployment organization-wide. There are many who certifies for all these frameworks: TMMI, TPI, Next, TMMI. Yes, of course. In certain industries, certificates are required. I'm not a fan of certificates because, in many cases, you can a little bit slightly trick the auditors. So, but there are companies like Indian companies. They tend to go for certificates because it's a way to get some business. So, but anyway, you shouldn't overhype those results, I think. Yep. And I think that was the last questions. And thanks for choosing me. And you can catch me in the corridor during the social event. Yeah, you can applaud, Attila. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.